Welcome, and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. During the question and answer session, please press *1 on your touch-tone phone. Today's conference is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. And if you do need any technical web assistance, please press * then 0. And now I will turn the meeting over to Ms. Kelly Holloway with the U.S. Department of Commerce. Ms. Holloway, you may begin.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our participants for joining us today for this Basic Guide to Exporting webinar on export licensing for encryption technology. We're very pleased to have with us a representative from the Bureau of Industry and Security of the Department of Commerce, and specifically the Information Technology Controls Division, and more on our presenter, Michael Pender, in just a moment. I want to share with you that this webinar series, is part of our effort at the Trade Information Center, the Department of Commerce, to help companies obtain the knowledge they need to export more, export successfully. It's also presented in support of the President's National Export Initiative, announced a couple of years ago to double exports by 2015, and the American economy is on its way to those targets. This series has a wealth of topics on everything from completing certificates of origin to finding overseas buyers to how to ship your product, HS reform. So a wealth of topics. I would encourage you to check it out, which you can find at export.gov/webinars. What you'll see here is our main web portal. A great resource. I encourage you to bookmark export.gov. You can utilize the search engine, which can be helpful because it is such a wealth of information. And the webinars that I just referenced can also be found from this main page on this Watch Archived Webinars link. Another takeaway besides this URL is this phone number, 1-800-USA-TRADE. That's to reach the Trade Information Center. You can be connected with a trade information specialist, which will direct you to the right resources for your export questions. With that, let me pull up the agenda for today. I am Kelly Holloway, as I mentioned, with the Trade Information Center. Our agency staffs the commercial sections of embassy consulates worldwide, in addition to a wealth of resources domestically through 108 offices. And if you're not yet working with your local trade specialist, I would encourage you to do so. Oftentimes, it's much easier to contact someone locally than far away. Today, as I mentioned, Michael Pender with the Bureau of Industry and Security has a very impressive background. You'll see the topics he's going to touch on. And to reiterate that this is a high level, the basics of exporting. And so there's a lot of technical details related to this topic of export licensing for encryption products. And he's, I'm sure, going to just scratch the surface, but we'll leave you with contact information for following up. Michael's been with BIS for about a decade. He's an engineer and a patent attorney and has a very impressive background. So do feel good that the people that are supporting you and working on export licensing matters know what they're doing. Worked in both the private sector and the public sector for the Department of Defense, is published, worked as a intellectual property law firm, and also at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. So with that, let me go ahead and pull up Michael's presentation. Get started with his remarks. Michael?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So, as Kelly said, this is really meant to be an overview. So I apologize in advance if it's going to disappoint anyone who expects us to do an in-depth coverage of encryption. But really, there's so many nuances to it and so many kind of rules and then exceptions to rules that the goal today is really more to cover the 90% situation, the things that people need to look out for who aren't familiar with it and maybe haven't dealt with the regulations before, and to provide a hand to basically people who are looking at these regulations for the first time and trying to figure out what it is they need to know and whether or not the regulations even apply to the products that they make. Rather than trying to make you encryption experts, the goal for today is really to help you find some of the information you're going to need for yourselves, and then when you need additional information, to know where to go and get that information, but not to try and give that all to you at once in 35 minutes, because frankly it would be like trying to drink from a fire hose, except I think that's probably a massive understatement in terms of just how much information would be involved. So the takeaway for today is to know basically what questions to ask and when you might need additional information or when to go and get additional information. And perhaps most importantly, what the resources are that you can reach out and grab to get some of that information when you need it. So I'm actually going to depart from the format here for a little bit for a moment, and we're going to go to the very last slide in this presentation, and we're going to start there. And this is probably going to seem a little counterintuitive, but the reason is I want you to see the additional information slide. I'd like you to take a look at some of these resources. If you're on a computer and you have the chance to pull up some of these web pages as we're going through the presentation today, I encourage you to do it. And the reason is this first thing, the BIS encryption website. A lot of the information that we're going to cover today is going to touch on or extract from information you can find on this site as well. And more than that, when you need to dig a little deeper, this is probably where you want to go first, because unlike the regulations that are a very technical form of writing, this website is actually organized in a way to make sense for people who haven't seen the regulations before and aren't perhaps comparing the next version of an encryption regulation to the previous version. People who aren't necessarily as technical as the engineers and people who aren't necessarily as legally inclined as the lawyers can go to this area and find something that will make sense to them. I'm going to call up the web page just now.
And while that's loading, let me also mention to all the participants that as Michael's going through his presentation, if questions come to mind, you do have a tab at the top of your screen. You'll see the Q&A tab, and there you can type in your written question, and we'll work to get through as many of those as we can during the Q&A session.
Okay. Now, can you see my web page, Kelly?
Not yet.
Okay. Give it a moment. I understand there's a momentary lag between calling something up and having it pushed out. So if you're not seeing it yet, don't panic.
Can I go ahead and pull it up? It's not.
Yeah, go ahead and pull it up, Kelly, because I don't want it to take too long on just showing people the page itself. Oh, it looks like I lost the connection to the conference center momentarily. I apologize, folks. We're having some technical difficulties today that we're trying to work through.
So what you see on your screen now is the BIS encryption homepage that Michael referenced in that last slide.
Kelly, I'm still seeing a message that a pop-up box attempting to restore the connection to the conference center. Can we safely assume that people can see the web page, though?
Yes.
Okay. Well, then I'm going to continue working, and we'll just hope that it'll reconnect properly. But the first item here is my item classified under Category 5, Part 2 of the EAR. And the reason, it's meant to be like a step-by-step series of questions here. And then you might ask yourself these questions, and in attempting to answer these, you'll find that a lot of items that you might not consider encryption items we would still look at as encryption items in a technical sense, and you have to dig a little deeper. But pressing beyond the surface, there's an awful lot of items that have encryption in them that we simply don't really regulate very tightly. And a question of understanding how those rules apply, I'll try and give you some context and some structure to look at that today. So I'm going to try and go to the first slide now.
The presentation is up, and if you're having technical difficulty on that end, Michael, then I can advance the slides for you.
Okay. I'm getting a message that it's trying to connect the video and that nothing is currently shared. But if you could call up the first slide for everyone. One that begins with overview.
We're there. Okay,
well, I can't see what you guys are seeing, but assuming we're all working off the same page. So the questions listed are, what are encryption items that require authorization to export? When is authorization required for exporting encryption items? Because it's not always required to get a license or something like that. What kind of export authorization are available? So with that, I'll try and help you choose between the different options that you've got, whether it be a license exception or something else. How to apply for authorization to export an encryption item. Somewhat straightforward process, actually. And then differences between a review request and notification, which is actually a question that someone had written in for us ahead of time. And then differences between restricted, unrestricted, and mass market encryption items.
What you hear in the background is we're sending in the cavalry. There's technical support. And Michael, you can continue to work through the slides, and I'll advance them.
Okay. Yeah, we seem to keep losing the connection today.
Yeah, it's because of our network within the building. So sorry about that, everyone. Our network is going off and on. But we're okay now, I think.
Well, I apologize, folks. We'll do the best we can today, and if we lose it, then we lose it. But until then, let's keep trying to make progress if we can. So our next slide is what is subject to the EAR. And more or less, it's any item exported from the United States, which seems simple enough, but probably requires a little further explanation. The way that our regulations work, think of it in terms of if you're sending something out of the United States that's functionally capable of encryption, something like a routing appliance or a VPN or a server, it really doesn't matter for export purposes whether it was made in the United States or made in a foreign country, imported in the United States, and then being resold. We basically treat everything that's leaving here the same, whatever its original national origin. So sometimes people have said, oh, well, I bought it in China and I'm just sending it back. Well, you're sending an encryption item out of the United States, and it requires authorization just like any other item of the same type, that is. Re-exports of U.S. origin items, so that could be an item sent to Italy, couldn't be re-exported to certain countries without getting permission first. It could also be an item sent to one country being resent or as reincorporated into a different item, and we have rules that apply to that. Now, this foreign-made products incorporating greater than de minimis U.S. controlled content. The de minimis rule was probably covered in the other introduction to exporting section. And the foreign-made direct product is also a rather complicated rule. I'm not going to get into those in great depth right now, but if you find yourself in a situation where you're talking about selling a component or selling a chip that's incorporated into a higher level assembly, and then the higher level assembly, like a computer or some other appliance is sold, it probably makes sense to just talk to us, because the details really matter a great deal on that. And the foreign direct product rule, not the most straightforward thing, but in the broadest sense, the de minimis rule for encryption and the foreign direct product rule for encryption aren't significantly different than for other products in the EAR, with the exception of some stuff around the edges when you use the ENC license exception. I wouldn't suggest you try and figure this all out right now. I would say if you'd like more information on it, look at EAR Part 734.2, because there's specific definitions of what it means for exports and what it means for re-exports, and it's not always what you would think. For example, the term exported is defined to include making software available for transfer outside of the United States, such as by putting it on an internet server where it could be downloaded. So even if you aren't actually putting the software in an envelope and shipping it to someone, or putting it on, if you aren't actually physically transmitting it to someone yourself, but you're placing it on a server where anyone in the United States, where anyone in the world can download it, then you're making it available for export out of the country. And that has, certain consequences, and it requires authorization. All right. What are encryption items that require authorization for export? Well, examples include rather common things that I'm sure most people are familiar with. Cellular phones, special purpose encryption components like chips, routers, gateways, firewalls, network infrastructure items that have information security features, financial transaction terminals like point-of-sale devices, inventory management systems with encryption, input devices with wireless encryption functionality, network switches, telecommunication infrastructure items with encryption features, generic computers when loaded with encryption software, software with encryption features, including mass-marketed operating systems, production, development, and use technology that you would use for making encryption items, such as blueprints, technical data, development instructions. It seems like the encryption item definition covers a lot, but there's actually quite a few things that actually have encryption in them that we don't consider encryption items under the EAR, and that requires a little explanation too. So one of the questions I got in before the presentation, I won't name the specific company, they can identify themselves later if they want to, but they use a software or utility to store and manage documents in the cloud. And the first item here is remote access to a system. Generally, if you're just logging into a system remotely and you're looking at stuff on the system and then you're getting out again, that's not an encryption item. You might be using encryption software on your end to access that system, and they might be using encryption software on their end to protect the system. But just passing encrypted data back and forth, such as, well, let's say I'm at home and I want to work on my time card, and we've got a server set up, and it doesn't matter whether I'm, checking in on my time card from a foreign country to update the information there. It's not passing software to my machine, generally. It's just passing data back and forth that happens to be encrypted, and we don't consider encrypted data to be an encryption item under the EAR. We consider the software or the hardware that does the encryption or the technology used to make those hardware and software items, but we don't control the content. Now, you could have something that's controlled in some other part of the EAR, like design blueprints for some kind of missile component, and that could be controlled. And it's controlled whether, if you send it out of the country in an encrypted format, because it's controlled if you printed it out on pages, if you printed it on a disk, if you handed it to someone, if you faxed it out of the country. It doesn't matter. It's controlled no matter what. But it doesn't change just because it's encrypted. So a lot of these questions that deal with cloud-type things, the thing you have to ask yourself is, am I sending that person any software that they have to have for access to the cloud? Or are they downloading any software to their machine that they have to have for access to the cloud that includes encryption in it? In which case, that software might be a controlled part that we might have a licensing authority over, but we don't get involved in the data typically. So music, video, multimedia, songs, videos, books, a lot of stuff is encrypted today just to protect people's intellectual property rights for copyright. We don't control those. They're not considered encryption items under the EAR. A lot of these items aren't even considered subject to our licensing jurisdiction if you get into it in more detail. I think that's 734.2 again. Other things like compression. People ask me so often about, we're using this coding technique to prepare a signal before we transmit it, or we're using CDMA, or we're using some kind of novel fixed coding scheme. Anything that's not really obscuring the information or hiding it isn't the sort of thing that we're looking at as an encryption item. So, well, I don't want to dwell too long on it. As I said, this is meant to be an overview. The last thing is medical devices. Most devices for treating patients may be required to have encryption in them just for anti-tampering reasons and stuff, reasons like that. And we don't consider medical devices to be encryption items either. So even if they have the strongest possible encryption available in them, we still don't control them as encryption items under our regulations. Now, for people who aren't familiar with what this rationale is, there's a note that's been added to our encryption regulations just in June of 2010, and it formally states more than just it has to have encryption in the product. It's been adopted by VOSNAR, which means it's part of the multilateral regime control, but it applies to all of Category 5, Part 2. And what it means is, what it says is there's a primary function test, and it says if the encryption is used for the primary function, and that primary function is not computing, networking, communications, or information security, then we don't consider it an encryption item. The example that comes to mind was something I saw a while back. We saw an ice cream machine. I mean, literally, it's a machine you walk up to, you tell it what flavor of ice cream you like. It flash freezes the mixed flavoring with the ice milk, but it's got a modem in it that can communicate with the satellite back, and it reports on things like how fresh is the milk, how full is the coin hopper, have people move the ice cream machine from where it's supposed to be to some other location. Clearly, the ice cream machine is not something that merits national security control. It uses encryption. It can talk over great distances to a satellite and back. and that particular component of it that can be used as a long-distance modem to a satellite and back, okay, that's a communication item. And if you were shipping just that particular modem from the ice cream machine, assuming it wasn't like specially made for ice cream use only, then we would look at that specific radio or the specific modem as being a communications item. But it doesn't mean that everything that uses encryption is also controlled as an encryption item. Now, to be fair, applying these can be somewhat difficult sometimes. So I'll walk through some of the examples. That first example, anti-piracy, let it move. Piracy and theft prevention for software, music, etc. So a music player with digital rights management software to prevent piracy of software, music, videos, or other multimedia, we wouldn't consider that an encryption item. However, if you had a telephone that was a communication item that also includes a music player, it doesn't not become controlled just because you've also got music playing capability.
We'll be right with you. They're just checking on his connection. Sorry for the interruption. I'm seeing a few questions coming in the Q&A tab. Just to remind you that you can submit questions there. We'll get to those after Michael's remarks in the last 20 minutes or so of the program. During that time, we'll also have an operator-facilitated question and answer, so you'll be able to ask your question directly of Michael in those last few minutes.
All right, folks, sorry, we're working with what we've got, working with what we might want to have sometimes. We should be on slide 6, so assuming everybody's on the same page right now, we should be looking at the same slide that's titled Not Encryption Items, Note 4. So last one I was talking about, I believe, was the music player, and the second example is similar in focus. I want to focus on the printing, reproduction, imaging, and video recording or playback. So we're talking about printers, digital video recorders, video cameras for security systems, video playback devices that let a person download content for viewing. Now, so this wouldn't include something like a multifunction fax machine, because a fax machine is a communications item. It wouldn't include a video conferencing system, since those are also used primarily for communication. So if you had a generic camera that's usable for just about anything, we normally would not consider that an encryption item anymore. And that's through this operation of Note 4. And then the last example I'm going to use for this page is the automotive, aviation, and other transportation systems at the very end there. So if you have software on a vehicle or an airplane that reports the number of hours the engine's been running, the temperature, fuel consumption, altitude, air-fuel mixture, that's not the sort of thing we meant by communications, even if it's communicating stuff about the plane. And it would no longer be controlled under Category 5, Part 2 as an encryption item. On the other hand, if you have a device for a passenger jet that lets people access the internet using their portable wireless devices while the plane's flying, then the item is primarily for communications, and it would be controlled under Category 5, Part 2. Now, there's no shortage of examples that may or may not fit in this list, and there's no shortage of items that can fall in the line where it's not so clear-cut whether it's one or the other. But in general, if you think Note 4 would apply and you're not sure, you don't necessarily have to go through some of the formal processes that we're going to get into later. I'd refer you back to that telephone number for the group line or the web page, because our intent is to start posting some examples of things that we consider not encryption items anymore. And that way you can look at the other examples and see whether it fits closely or not. So we're going to slide 7. Now, components that are general purpose devices do not get special treatment because one of the possible applications is on that list. For example, an encryption component that could be used in both voice-over IP telephones and in an internet video camera, it can be used for communication some of the time, so it doesn't receive more favorable treatment just because it could be used in an internet camera. But if you had something that was specially designed and was only usable in something like the internet camera and couldn't be used for video conferencing, then that's something we'll consider when we're trying to figure out how to classify or control the component. And when I say classify or control, we haven't really gotten into that yet, but think of it along the lines of if you're not sure which way your product would likely be controlled and whether Note 4 would apply or not, you can use our classification process and just ask us. Or you can pick up the phone and just ask us. And if we think it's clear-cut, we'll tell you what the answer is. And if we're not sure, or if for some other reason you want to have a documented answer on paper, a formal answer from the Department of Commerce that you can share with your shippers, or if you're transshipping through certain countries and they want documentation, then we can approach it that way. There's a whole bunch of decontrol notes at the beginning of Category 5, Part 2. I'm not going to get into those right now. I believe there's 10 of them the last time I looked, and they get into very specific subject matter about whether the algorithms are public or not. It's important to know that they're there. It's not important to try and have them all memorized. That's what we're here for, is to help you walk through it. And then finally, use of encryption for communication. If you're using encryption for a communications item, that's the last bullet point here, which talks about how it's being used. Say you have an item that's a communications item, and you're using encryption in it, but you're not using it to protect the privacy of the communications back and forth. Maybe you're using it to protect the software on the device against being reverse engineered so your competitors can't copy it. We consider what the use of encryption is in the item as well, and sometimes it leads to more favorable treatment. And the reason I've got this slide in here for these considerations is when you do have to submit a request for a classification because you're not sure how it's going to be controlled, the more information you can give us in terms of whether it's general purpose or application specific, what the functions of the item are. For instance, how is it used? Who is it sold to? What would they use it for? Putting things in that context helps us better understand what your product is and how it fits in the marketplace. All right. So I've told you a bunch of things that are encryption items, and I've told you some things that aren't encryption items, which kind of leads us full circle into what does that mean again. And at the risk of oversimplifying things, it's the items that are identified in Category 5, Part 2 of the list. They're designed to use cryptography. Their primary function is one of these four things. And it's not one of those fixed schemes for transmission of information to make sure it's not corrupted or tampered with. It doesn't involve hidden or obscured information. That doesn't mean it wouldn't be controlled somewhere in Category 5, Part 2, but it's not what we're really referring to when we talk about encryption items in the scope of this presentation today. Now, sometimes I get questions about whether the use of mathematical functions like hashing functions are considered encryption, or the use of steganography considered encryption. And that reference to fixed coding actually appears in Category 5, Part 2, and in the write-up for ECCN 5A002. And the reason that this matters is encryption is mathematics. It's algorithms for how to make something obscured. And sometimes you're doing that for the reason of hiding information, and sometimes you're using it for something else, like just making sure that information hasn't been tampered with, for a digital signature or something else. All of these uses might be under Category 5, Part 2 somewhere. But really what we're looking for is when these algorithms are being used to obscure information. So getting back to that hashing question, think about this less about, is this some new algorithm that I haven't seen before, and do we control this algorithm as well as all the other algorithms? Think of it more in terms of, are you using it to obscure information? Because it really doesn't matter so much whether it's a brand new algorithm we've never seen before. New stuff comes out on this market all the time. The real question you want to be asking yourself is it ensuring the privacy of information, or is it being used for some other purpose like that coding scheme to make sure that everything's received reliably? Moving to slide 9 now. Oh, that's right. This is one of those ones that comes up in pieces. All right. First thing you need to do to figure out how your product is going to be controlled, now that you know whether it's an encryption item or not, is the ECCN that would apply. The first couple there all begin with 002. Those are items that are controlled into the Wassenaar arrangement, and it means they're controlled for encryption item, national security, and anti-terrorism reasons. The next one there, 5B002, just national security and anti-terrorism reasons. For this group here, the practical impact between the two is not all that different. Either way, you're going to require some kind of authorization to export those out of the country. In that last group, the ones that ends with 992, these are subject to United States unilateral controls. They're controlled for anti-terrorism reasons only. And the reason that matters is if the TSU-EAR item is classified and you find out that it's under 5A2, 5D2, 5E2, 5B2, any of those, you're going to require some kind of authorization to export it to just about any country but Canada. But for the last three, 5A992, 5D992, and 5E992, these can be exported to most countries on Earth outside of country group E without having to get an individual license each time. Now, someone had asked ahead of time, what's the significance of these different groups, and what's the difference between A, B, D, E. There's subtle differences in terms of how different countries became members of the group. And it gets into foreign policy things that are really just beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. But when I talk about country group E, what I'm talking about is countries that are either under UN embargo or countries that are being essentially blocked because of supporting terrorism acts in the past. So there are 5 countries on that list, I believe. It's Sudan, North Korea, Cuba, Iran, and Syria. And if you want to sell anything in Category 5, Part 2, even stuff that's controlled for anti-terrorism reasons only to any of those countries, you're going to want to proceed very carefully. You're going to, in all likelihood, need a license for it anyway. We're going to get into different types of export authorizations that are available in just a moment. We're going to talk about license exceptions and other things. But overwhelmingly, it won't make any difference. If you're sending it to one of those countries, you're pretty much still going to have to get a license, and possibly a license from more than one government agency. I think if you were sending something to Cuba, you might have to get a license from us and a license from OFAC, which is Treasury as well, and possibly some kind of permissions from the Coast Guard or something, as I understand, that you can't even just ship things back and forth. Anyway, like I said, I'm trying to focus on the 90% today instead of on the esoteric stuff around the edges. Suffice to say, if you want to send it to one of those countries in Group E, call us up and ask us, because it doesn't happen all that often, and it's going to require a little more thought and a little more attention to the details. So, moving to slide 10, I mentioned a little bit about what kind of export authorizations are available. That first license exception, TSU, it's used for publicly available items. One of the questions came in ahead of time. Let's see what the exact question was. Can't find it now. All right, I'll just paraphrase it. Someone was asking about their company is using OpenSSL to do the encryption, and they're coming up with a new product. TSU is used for publicly available items. Publicly available is not the same thing as open source. Just because something is open source doesn't mean that it meets the definition for publicly available, because publicly available is a legal test. It looks at more than just, is it available to everyone, but also at what cost, are there strings attached, are there restrictions on the distribution of it. Anyway, if you want to learn more about that and you think publicly available license exception TSU might apply, look at 740.13. But I will explain in terms of that question. I get this one a lot. And if all you were doing was putting OpenSSL on a disk and sending it to someone, then yeah, TSU would probably apply for that, because I believe OpenSSL is both publicly available and free. However, most companies don't just take that stuff and put it on a disk and send it out. They create new software that calls on it, the added value. And that authorization for TSU doesn't apply to some other product that happens to be calling encryption from a library that's open and publicly available, unless the product as a whole is open and publicly available. So it doesn't matter really whether you're calling encryption functions from a chip, from a processor, from the operating system, from some kind of dedicated special circuit, from a library like OpenSSL. The questions we asked earlier really apply to what does your product do. And if your product is doing communication and it gets past the Note 4 criteria, then your product is an encryption item. And for our purposes today, it doesn't much matter whether it's using OpenSSL or some other method of getting its encryption. It's still an encryption item, and it requires authorization like everything else that works more or less the same way. The next license exception is ENC. We're going to cover this in a little bit of depth today, but we're not going to in any way get to the level of depth that it takes to really understand that license exception, because And it's rather complicated. If you have something that's free and you're giving it away, take a look at TSU, because if you can meet that notification requirement by sending in an email, there's very little effort required to basically meet the legal requirements and be on your way about it. This next one, ENC, there's a registration requirement. Now, people have asked me about registration, and do you have to do this for each product that your company makes? Registration is for the company, and it's questions like, what kind of product does your company make? And people have asked me also, do I need to file a new registration each time we add a new product line? If you add new product lines, update your registration once a year. I believe that's the way the requirements work. If you want to see a little bit more about it, there's actually a pretty good explanation on that on the website, again at www.bis.doc.gov/encryption. It's not something I really deal with too much because I don't really process registrations, and I don't want to steer you wrong, so whatever it says in there is probably more accurate than my recall. And if I had a question, that's where I would go and look. And then the last thing is encryption review. And the more complicated the item, the more likely it's going to end up with an encryption review. And when I say complicated items here, I'm talking about things like network infrastructure items regularly end up there. And whether it ends up controlled under one ECCN or another ECCN depends on a lot of details about ranges and speeds and functionality that's built into it. It requires a lot of knowledge of the specific product. So in terms of effort, if you can get by under TSU, great, minimal effort. If you need to put a little more effort in and you're looking for something that's going to meet your business needs, probably 80 to 90% of the encryption-related exports that go out of the country each year go out under license exception ENC. If you do it once, you don't have to do it again unless you change the encryption functionality. You don't have to do it again if you just change the name of the product or the company gets bought out. It's kind of a minimal amount of effort for most people. Mass market review, in many ways it's very similar to the license exception ENC review. There's a couple special requirements on it, and it's meant to cover products that are offered for retail sale. And then the next is there are always other license exceptions. So if you've covered some of the other stuff available in the EAR that might meet your needs, don't forget about temp. If you're just taking something out of the country temporarily and bringing it back, or bringing something into the country temporarily and evaluating it and then sending it back. Don't forget about GOV when you want to send stuff to U.S. personnel wherever they're located. And don't forget about bag if you're just talking about stuff on someone's immediate person when they're going out of the country and coming back with it again. Because you don't have to go through all the complicated processes required for an ENC authorization if you're just having an executive going out of the country and taking a laptop with them with a bunch of software on it. But be aware of what the requirements are for use of these license exceptions to make sure you're using them properly. Now, mentioning that website again, I'm going to switch to it for just a moment. Content, share. Oh. That's not right. Sorry, my bad. Kelly, can you hear me?
I can. I can go to the website.
Yeah, I can't see the website. Oh, I see. It's another tab on the same one. All right. Let me know when people can see the website, okay, Kelly?
Yes, we can see it. You need to switch the tabs.
Gotcha. You should see it now. So I'm back on the bis.doc.gov/encryption website. And some of these things here, I'm not going to go through step-by-step and tell you how to do each of these things today, like how to file an encryption registration. What I want you to do is look here at the website and see that you can just look up the exact steps on how to file an encryption registration.
Michael, it's not coming up on my screen, so I'm guessing it's not coming up on the others. I can navigate to it if you want to talk through.
All right, let's do that.
Okay.
All right. So I apologize, folks, if you're not seeing what I'm seeing. What I've done is I've gone to the website, and it's www.bis.doc.gov, like World Wide Web, Bureau of Industry and Security, Department of Commerce, Government, and then /encryption. And you should be looking at a page titled EAR Controls for Items that Use Encryption. And the steps for doing these things, like filing a registration or filing a self-classification all of this is laid out right here in terms of, you know, for instance, item number 3. If you determine that your item is classified under Category 5, Part 2, so it's an encryption item, and if your answer to question number 2 is no, which means you can't just self-classify it, then you must file an encryption registration. So this is how to go through the process of actually filing those steps for your company, filing that paperwork for your company, and how to file an encryption registration. It's the next link down. If you click on it, it'll literally take you through what do you put in each block of the form and what kind of information are we asking for. And hopefully this will be real straightforward and real helpful. All right, now I'm assuming that you can't see what I'm seeing, so I'm going to go back to the other page. But I just want you to keep in mind that a lot of what we're covering here, for anyone who's joined us since the very beginning, a lot of this information is right here on the website. And I'm not going to do a better job today trying to read it off to you than you will have yourself being able to read through it at your own pace and work through it. But whether you're talking about self-classification or filing an encryption review or filing a mass market review, by all means come back here and look at this. Now, I will say that just looking at this may not give you a sense of the best way, the best order in which to do these different steps. So assuming that you've got to get an authorization for your company and you have to do an encryption review, here's what I'd suggest. First, you want to sign up to use SnapR. That's the system for filing these things online, and it can take several days to get signed up for it. And then the next thing you would do would be file your company registration, your encryption registration number. Now, if you're doing some very simple stuff and you don't have to do the encryption registration, we'll get into that in a couple minutes, then maybe it's a wasted step. But for everybody else, this will save you a lot of time, because I see an awful lot of encryption reviews that get all the way down to the last step, and they haven't done the encryption registration. And under certain paragraphs of the ENC license exception, we can't write the authorization to begin exporting until we get that encryption registration number. And then once you've got that company registration done, and you submit your encryption review or your mass market review, include that encryption registration number in the additional information block. It's actually required under the regulations, but people forget to do it all the time, and it always delays processing other applications. And in a worst case scenario, I've seen it take months where they didn't do it and they didn't know how to do it, and everything's been all set to go for this one poor guy I've got in mind. And the only thing we're waiting on is just that 6-digit number so I can just issue the authorization and he can start exporting. Anyway, I feel bad for him, but there's nothing we can do about it until that comes through. And then finally, let me go back to that slide. Oh, Kelly, I lost the connection again.
Okay, well, we are on slide 11. What kinds of export authorization are available?
Yeah, I have license exception TSU for slide 11.
Okay, there it is. We're ready.
All right, so the source code must be available to the general public. And when I say available at no charge, or available at charge that doesn't exceed the cost of reproduction and distribution, and then no limitations on further distribution. So, for example, if you're giving your software away for free, I'm sorry, I'm rushing through this. I apologize, folks. I see that we're running short on time towards the end, and I'm trying to move perhaps more quickly than I should. And we're going to take about 10 more minutes to go through the remaining slides, and I'm going to be covering these relatively quickly. So if you do have questions afterwards, you've got our contact information. By all means, follow up. And I apologize, but we're just trying to do what the best we can today with the situation. But anyway, license exception TSU, very useful for the free stuff, very useful for the publicly available things. Keep in mind this limitation on no limitations on further distribution. So if you're giving software away, but you're requiring that they sign up for a maintenance plan, or you have restrictions and say they can't turn this free software over to other people afterwards or distribute it, then it's not going to be eligible for TSU. The notifications are something I've gotten some questions about. This can be satisfied by simply sending an email to these two addresses that are listed. When license exception TSU is available, it's very, very easy. And actually, there have been regulatory changes just in the last year so that certain mass market and 5D002 object code software that used to be still subject to EAR jurisdiction have now been removed from controls under the EAR once this license exception TSU requirements are met. I'm not going to have the time to get into it in detail today, but I would encourage you to give me a call afterwards or follow up with me if you'd like to, and we can discuss how it works. There haven't been any changes in regulatory requirements lately in terms of the requirement to send a notification in. I know one of the questions I've gotten was, does the person still have to do that? I've gotten one question from a lady who says that they have to do it every year. Now, I don't know why they'd be doing it every year, because TSU is really, whenever you put a new version of the source code out there that you want to have people accessing, or a new version of the product. And it's not an annual requirement or anything, so it might just be that's how often they put the new product versions up. Next slide, Kelly. Okay, license exception ENC. Now, I know in one of the descriptions for this presentation today, it said we were going to distinguish between retail and some other things, but really retail was an old term that was used for the encryption stuff before I came to work on the encryption stuff. So that's got to be at least kind of 5 years out of date. And if someone's describing products that are covered under the ENC license exception using terms like retail, they probably haven't looked at the regulations lately. So not meant to be a slam to whoever helped prepare that description of it initially, but the regulations have changed a lot in the recent past. This paragraph B1, for example, self-classifiable items. This is something new that's been introduced lately. So even if an item has to be classified, sometimes you can do it yourself for your company and just put the description in a folder and then file what's called the self-classification report once a year and talk about what items you self-classified and are shipping. And you don't have to wait on any kind of authorization back from the government. You just, do the encryption registration for your company and send in the self-classification report, and that's it. And I wish I had the time to get into these and distinguish between these in greater depth. But what I will say is the restricted items are the ones that require licenses for sale to certain government customers around the world, but can be authorized for export to commercial people wherever they are, outside of country group E1. That's the people that are under UN sanction and embargoed countries again. Unrestricted items can be sold to both government and non-government customers, and then self-classifiable items can be sold to government and non-government customers. You don't even have to send in the stuff and get a classification from the government. One of the questions I'd gotten ahead of time was, do I still have to do semi-annual reports for the products that I'm selling? On this page here, the restricted items still require semi-annual reports of where the transactions went. A small section of the unrestricted items, that's the ones under 740.17 B3, and then just the Roman 3. Those ones still require it. Self-classifiable items do not. Items under paragraph B4, which isn't even listed here, they don't either. Also, items that were previously under B3, if you had like an old classification, but if they would be under paragraph B1 these days, you don't have to do it. There's a couple exceptions having to do with certain cases where something was B3 before, B3 previously, and is now B3 III or B2. But if you have questions and you think you might be in a special situation, just give us a call. In fact, that's probably going to be my refrain for most of these questions today, is if you think you have a special situation, you don't have to try and figure these all out by yourself. I had a couple questions that are kind of relevant to this page here, including, is a product that contains Suite D algorithms exportable under license exception? Is a product that contains elliptic curve cryptography exportable under license exception? You only have to get license exception ENC once and you're covered. Basically, we don't usually do distinctions on specific algorithms. There's some non-standard cryptography out of China called WAPI, and the reason it's considered non-standard is because the details of how to do it haven't been published. And when you have something that's non-standard like that, there are certain requirements. And sometimes when you're using published, commercially available algorithms, the rules that apply are a little more lenient or a little more flexible. But in general, ENC is going to authorize just about anything independent of how strong that encryption is. If it's, very weak, I shouldn't use weak encryption as a term. If it's the older stuff like DES, or if it's very simple encryption, sometimes they're not controlled under a national security control anyway, and you don't even have to go through this. But assuming that you're talking about most of the products that are in use these days and the encryption that's in common use, then yeah, you just do the ENC license exception once. You describe the encryption functionality in your product for it, and when it when you change your product and it doesn't apply anymore, then you just have to do a new review. or look at whether new review is required anyway. I'm going to the next slide, so mass market review. There's a couple criteria here. You don't have to try and figure it all out from my writing here on this page. What you do is you look at the beginning of Category 5, Part 2, and there's a note there. It's Note 3. It's just before Note 4, which I referred to earlier. Note 4 is also there. And these are the criteria. And it's more or less what you'd expect. It's the sort of product you'd be able to buy at a retail store. You can't really mess with the encryption functionality yourself. It's designed for a user to install it without a lot of additional support, and when necessary, the details are available. There isn't a particular price point that's required for mass market review, but generally when we're talking about authorizing a product for mass market review, we're talking about items that are being sold, in the hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands, not onesie-twosies, 10 a week or 10 a year or for $500,000 a piece. So then it starts to stretch credibility. Classification and self-classification. Take a look at these sections of the regulations. Take a look at the types of products that are listed. A good example of restricted and unrestricted items that we see again and again, especially the stuff that regularly gets controlled under 740.17b2, are network infrastructure items. Routers, VPNs, appliances, not so much firewalls unless they also include encryption functionality. But they're the sort of things you'd use to create very big, very large infrastructure systems. Not the sort of things you would sell at Best Buy or even like Home Depot, where a person might go and install it in their home machines, in their homes generally. It can happen, but it's not the general trend. Everything other than the stuff listed in paragraphs B2 and B3 can be self-classified. So just take a look at those, and if your products that your company makes aren't listed there, if you can self-classify it, that's by far the less difficult approach, provided you're comfortable with the technology. And if it's not something you've done before and you're not particularly comfortable with it, one approach is to request a classification or two from the government and use them as examples for classifying the other products in your inventory. So you do a couple test cases, and then you say, well, this is just like that. I'll write it up in the same way and self-classify it. One of the questions I got was 740.17 still requires us to submit a semi-annual encryption report for items approved for ENC license exception before the most recent changes to the encryption regulations. These items were grandfathered in, but as I read the regulations, we still need to send in the old semi-annual report for items. Is this correct? Well, if they were, for example, B3 items before, B3 items previously under the old regulations, and now they would be those B1 items that are self-classifiable, then nope, you can self-classify them and you don't need to send reports in anymore. If you'd like to have a piece of paper from the government that changes the outcome from the previous piece of paper from the government, you can send it in for a classification, and we'll write back to you that it's self-classifiable, and then you can just send the self-classification report in the next year, and you don't have to continue tracking the transactions and reporting it. So I'm going on to the next slide for registration requirements. Company registration, and that should say 5E002 items in the first bullet point. All right, so basically if you're talking about items that are controlled under paragraph B1, B2, or B3, the most common ones you're going to deal with almost all the time. Then you need to do a company registration. That's when they issue the encryption registration number, that 6-digit number that starts with an R. You do one registration per company. You don't have to update it every time you do a new product. You add a bunch of new products to your product line that weren't covered before. You can do a new encryption registration at the start of the next year. And then if you want to share that information with your resellers or something, an exporter can rely on the manufacturer's registration or product classification, but we don't provide that information. So we won't tell you whether or not the manufacturer that makes the product that you're trying to resell has had a classification done or what the outcome was. And part of the reason is that we're not allowed to under the law. It's protected as private information, even as to whether or not a classification has been done. But there's absolutely no restriction on your company sharing those with your resellers or your distributors, if that makes sense for you. We just won't do that for you because we're not allowed to. The next slide is on the annual report of exported products. Now, really, this is not a product-by-product list of exported products. This is This is a slide I got from someone else, and I don't really like the way it's describing this concept. Think of this as the Supplement H report. And if you go back to the website, you'll see a couple different reports that you can do depending on how you're doing self-classification. So the self-classified items report is one. If you're doing exports of B2 items or items under B3 Roman 3, which is the sort of products that you'd use for forensics and looking at certain types of private communications for court use, rather restricted items, there is ongoing tracking in terms of where those are reported. There's a very specific format in terms of what information has to be reported. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this right now, just because we don't have a lot of time to spend. I would suggest that the website is actually probably the best place I can think of to go to for more information on it. And if you ask any questions on this that I don't know, that's where I'm going to go look, because that's where the best write-up on what sort of information, actual examples, and how to format things appears. Now, what happens when the license exception is not available? We talked about TSU, we talked about ENC, we talked about some of those other things. But you can't always use a license exception. If you're wanting to send something to one of those Group E countries, you can bet there won't be a license exception available. So you can do individual licenses, and these are often used for specific transactions with identified parties, specific goods. You want to know what the end user's purpose for the goods are, and they usually have about a 2-year validity period. But for this group, what you probably want to know more about is this encryption licensing arrangement. This is a very special form of license that can be open-ended. It involves limited sales. You have to identify the goods that are going to go out. They're usually for government end users, because that's when you usually have the biggest issue with having to get a license instead of using a license exception. And you can define a certain country you want to send it to, or a group of countries, and they usually have a 4-year validity period instead of a 2-year validity period, so you don't have to come in all the time. And then finally, no license required transactions. I mentioned those 5A992, 5D992, and 5E992 items. Unfortunately, if you want to send them to one of those countries that's blocked for anti-terrorism reasons or UN embargo reasons, there might still be legitimate reasons to send stuff there, but you're going to have a license, and you're going to have to call in and request it. And if you're sending it to one of those countries, well, give us a call or give the foreign policy folks a call, because it'll actually be treated as a foreign policy license, not so much as an encryption license. In that sense, it's really treated not so much for its encryption functionality or because it's special for encryption reasons, but it's treated because of the end user and the end users to which the product is going. Now, if you didn't take anything else away from this presentation today at all, other than the fact that there's ELEs available that allow you to sell to sensitive and less sensitive government customers throughout the world by only filing one license once that covers your products for 4 years, this would be the thing to focus on and take away from today. It's really useful, especially if you have a whole bunch of related countries or similar products that you're stocking for an entire area, and if your product line doesn't change too often. There's lists of what we consider less sensitive government users and more sensitive government users. Oh, I just lost my connection to the conference center again. Less sensitive users would be, for example, patent offices, social service offices, unemployment offices. More sensitive government end users would be things like police departments, prisons, military customers. I'm not going to try and paraphrase that entire list because it's actually pretty lengthy. But I think there's examples of that. If they're not posted on the website yet, our plan is to do that shortly. If you'd like a representative copy of that list and there's nothing up there yet, you can email me and I'll send you a copy with all the specific information for a specific transaction cut out. We're trying to move in a direction of standardizing those just to make it easier. So if you're asking for all of the less sensitive government end users in some certain area of the world, it gives you a relatively straightforward way of requesting a license that lasts a long period of time, 4 years instead of the typical 2, and doesn't require a great deal of specificity in terms of like all the level of detail we'd otherwise have to classify a product. So if you're a distributor, or you're repackaging somebody else's product and you don't have access to all of the information on the encryption algorithms and stuff in it, using an ELA or using an individual license to complete a specific transaction, probably a better way to go. The other things like the license exceptions under ENC, that require a great deal of knowledge of what the product is and what it does, that's probably better for someone who's acting as a manufacturer because they have all the information available at their fingertips where they can get it. All right, so I'm going on to the next slide. NLR items. So some of the items that you self-classify as mass market, those can be 5A992, 5D992, 5E992. We don't have a 5B992. Again, no license required doesn't mean that you never have to get a license. It just means that no license is required for most end users, most end uses, in most countries on the planet. If you wanted to send it to someone in Cuba, you're still going to have a license. If you wanted to send it to a denied party or a designated foreign terrorist group, you're still going to have a license. But it's the rare exception and not the normal situation. And then for those, we don't usually have to review them, either because they are self-classifiable or because you don't have to send them in for review at all, just because the way the classification scheme works. And finally, back to our additional information slide. By all means, I really encourage you to take a look at the website if you're starting off with encryption and really look there before trying to figure out how this stuff works from looking at the relevant sections of the regulations, because it's just so hard to try and start with 740.17 or 742.15 and really get a sense of what this process is and how it works. It's just so much more straightforward to look at the question-oriented approach in the website and begin there.
Thank you, Michael. Much detailed information, and which we will be sharing in a recorded copy version to all participants so that you can go back and listen and review some of his helpful comments as it applies to your situation. And I hope that you'll indulge us, since we had some technical errors, to go a little bit longer to get to some of the questions. Operator, can you come on and invite the participants?
Yes, certainly. Thank you. At this time, if you would like to ask a question, please press *1 on your touch-tone phone. Please unmute your phone and record your name when prompted. To withdraw your question, press *2. Again, please press *1 to ask a phone question. One moment, please.
And while we're waiting for those to come in, we certainly have a lot in the queue as well. You still have your connection, Michael? Can you see those questions?
I do. I see some where I see like a person's name and no question, but I see some that I can definitely go ahead and start answering right now. So.
Please, why don't you take a couple?
All right, so the first one is our next encryption software product. It's available for download over the Internet. Do I need to restrict, based upon IP address, where potential clients can download from? I'd say the first thing to do is figure out how your product is likely to be controlled. If your product is going to be controlled for national security reasons, then look at how you're going to get authorization for export. If you're going to use the TSU license exception, great. Then that's probably all that you need to do, but we can discuss it in a little more depth. If you're going to use the ENC license exception, and especially if it's a restricted product where you'd have to have a license for sale to government users, then yes, you're going to have requirements to restrict either based upon IP address or whether it's a .gov or .mil or some other address, because you don't have authorization to export the restricted items to a government customer without getting a license or some other form of authorization first.
Thank you. Operator, is there a question on the line?
I'm kind of skipping through that quickly, but it basically turns on whether there's a national security control applied to the product after you've been through your authorization process.
Operator, is there a question on the line?
We do have one question. If you did press *1, your line is open. You may go ahead, please.
Yes, this is Dr. Smita Marta from West Virginia University. Mr. Pender, I'm more interested in the topic of encryption as related to deemed export issues in academics. Would you please once again bring me up to speed on that? When I do the I-129 certifications, and what if the foreign employees have access to some encryption software on campus? Just please bring me up to speed on that. I know I keep asking you this question all the time.
Yeah, I'll take a moment, but really this is kind of a very specific one that we've spoken about offline previously, and I don't want to, it's going to be so specific to your situation. I'm not sure it's going to apply to a lot of these people, but think of it more in terms of if you have a student here in the United States and they're on your campus and they're using software, like they're using some desktop software that's got encryption in it, and maybe it's 5D002 software. But they're not exporting the software as a country. They're not taking it with them.
Yep.
So there's no literal export there.
Yeah.
And if they're a student or an intern, there's paragraphs under, I think it's paragraph A under the ENC license exception that lets you, share most of the stuff with people that are students or contractors or interns, as long as they're not from country group E1. If you're from country group, if they're a student from country group E1, like an Iranian national student, then you might have to get some kind of authorization for it. But again, it's only if you're transferring controlled technology there. So you're not actually giving them the software to take back to Iran with them. You're not giving them the hardware to take back to Iran with them. The deemed export situation would only be something like encryption technology that you're exposing them to. And then we start getting into, are you really dealing with something that's academic information that's not even subject to the EAR, or are you having them participate in like a project team to develop some commercial product? So the one time that they're really going to have it is if you bring in a national from country group E1, like an Iranian student, and they're working on like a work study project to develop some commercial item.
Yep.
And that commercial item involves controlled encryption technology. Then yes, you're going to have a deemed export license.
Okay,
Other than that factual situation, it's not going to come up very often.
Yeah, thanks. Let's move to some of the other questions, and then for additional clarification, I think you can follow up on this very specific issue separately. Thank you. But related to the movement then of people and software and encrypted products back and forth, one question came in, and many questions that we get at the Trade Information Center are related to an employee that's traveling overseas with a laptop, for example, that has encryption software on it. And the question is if there's any reporting requirements or anything special that company would need to do to have them carry with them or in advance of that travel.
Okay, well, the question breaks down like all the others. You start by asking what are the items that are coming and going and how are they classified. You look at whether or not that particular item would require a license for export to the country where the person's going. And then if you say that authorization would be required, you look at whether or not one of the license exceptions is going to apply that would do it very easily. And for someone coming and going, there's two license exceptions that are probably going to cover that almost all the time. And one is BAG, B-A-G, which deals with stuff on their immediate person that they've kind of got responsibility for. And the other is TMP, or temporary, which deals with temporary imports and exports of items, including encryption items. So it's actually not any different for encryption than it is for any other item that you'd be taking out of the country that would be subject, that you'd be applying a BAG or a TMP to. So we can get into the TSU authorization and ENC authorization, but that's an area where actually encryption items work like pretty much everything else. Look and see whether or not those two license exceptions will deal with the situation, because most of the time they will. It deals with tools of the trade. It deals with stuff you might be taking out for a product demonstration. It deals with short-term exports for qualifying your product. I think you'll find that those will already cover it, and it's really nothing specific to encryption there. It's just like any other product.
Okay, thank you. Are there one or two other questions that you would address in the list?
There's a whole bunch here. Can you give a little guidance about when an encryption IC that already has a CCAT needs to have a new review because of the addition of new interface standards that might include higher I/O throughput? Generally, changing functionality of an encryption item that doesn't have anything to do with encryption doesn't usually require a new review. It's changes to the encryption functionality. One exception would be if you're designing some kind of part for a network infrastructure item, and some of the criteria for network infrastructure depends on how fast the item is or how many encrypted bits per second it can crank out. So if you were changing it from one performance class to another performance class such that the item you make from it would have a new ENC paragraph that would apply, well then it makes sense to have the encryption IC reviewed. But other than that, if you're not changing the encryption functionality, you pretty much don't need to send it in for a review again, because the encryption functionality is what we look at for the reason for control for most of these items.
And what if a company has acquired another company that has encryption technology that requires registration but was already registered? what are the dynamics in that scenario when a firm acquires another company in their technology?
Well, we don't require them to come in and do a new registration, but they might want to, especially if they're incorporating a whole bunch of, or consolidating a whole bunch of offices under a single umbrella. Because basically each time someone comes in and does the encryption registration, there's a number assigned, and that person becomes the administrator for all the different encryption applications for that particular group. So let's say you've got a large multinational company with an office in one country and an office in another, and your intent is to have them file their own applications and run them separately. Well, employees come and go from a company every so often, and you want to have one person who can act as the administrator and oversee the portfolio of these applications over time and oversee this portfolio of licenses and other items so they can have access to the company's authorizations for export. But, you know, again, it becomes a question of what's the best business practice, not so much what's our regulatory requirement. We don't require them to come in and update it just because the company name has changed.
Okay, thank you. Operator, is there another question in the queue? We'll take one more.
Yes, we do have Johnny Tronklater. Your line is open.
Hi. Assuming an ENC exception applies to a 5A002 item controlled for EI, NS, and AT reasons, does this exception only apply to the EI reason for control, such that would one still have to fulfill license application requirements associated with the item's national security reason for control? Or does the ENC exception relieve license application requirements associated with all three reasons for control?
I understand why you're asking the question, and partly it has to do with the confusing way in which that section of the regulations are written. But think of it not so much in terms of releasing the control as authorizing the export within the scope of the ENC license exception. So in other words, if you have an item and you're sending it out of the country and it's national security controlled, and it's, I think the way that it works is the EI controls come off if you do like a mass market thing and not for other items. But think of it not so much in terms of those letters coming off, but you have to have some kind of authorization for that export to occur. And maybe you have to have authorization because it's an EI controlled item, or maybe you have to have authorization because it's an NS controlled item. Or a more straightforward way to think of it is at the transaction level. I want to send this product to this person in certain country, and I look at the ENC license exception and I say, does it allow me to do that? And if the answer is yes, it allows me to do it, then you look at, well, what are the constraints? Do I have to fill out some report? Do I have to fill out some kind of encryption registration for the company? And that'll make more sense then, because the item is controlled the same way, but you could maybe authorize the export to that country and that person and through some other methods, like the TMP license exception or the TSU license exception or the BAG or the government. Or there's no requirement that you use a particular license exception to send the product out. You can use whatever fits the facts and the circumstances, unless you do it in the most straightforward way that suits your company's needs.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. So we have indulged you, Michael, with an extra time and extra questions, and I want to thank all the participants for staying on the line, those of you who've been able to. Again, we'll send out a recording from the program today. We'll also do our best to take a look at the questions that have come in and are still in the queue to get those answers out to you. But most important, in the slide that's still up, you see the where to go for more information and to get the clarification you need. So with that, Michael, any last comments you'd like to make to those still on the line?
Just that I've still got about 20 questions here, so I think what I'm going to do is go through and maybe try and answer some of these and email the answers to people right now before I go.
Perfect.
And then if this isn't specific enough, you've got I think you've got our contact information, and you can follow up with me later.
Good. Well, thank you for that offer, and thank you again to all of our participants for joining our Basic Guide to Exporting webinar program today. Bye-bye.
Thank you for participating on today's conference call. You may disconnect at this time.